The snow was falling thick and heavy that morning, covering the Montana plains in a blanket of white. Inside the old stable at Harrison Ranch, the air was cold enough to turn every breath into mist. Emma Hart knelt on the hard ground, her worn gloves soaked through, scraping frozen mud from the floor. Her hands ached from the cold, her back screamed with pain, but she kept moving. She had no choice. Her children were sleeping in a cabin half a mile away, and there was no food left except for a few stale biscuits. She worked fast, hoping to finish before sunrise so no one would see her there. The lantern light flickered over her tired face, thin, pale, and too young to look so old. Only 28, but the months since her husband's death had added years to her eyes. The wind slipped through the cracks in the stable walls, biting at her cheeks. The smell of hay and horses filled the air, mixed with the faint scent of manure and cold iron. She had been doing this for 2 weeks, sneaking into the stable before dawn, cleaning stalls in secret. The ranch hands arrived later in the morning, never knowing who kept the place tidy overnight. Emma didn't want anyone to know it was her. Pride was all she had left, and she wanted to keep it a little longer. Just 3 more stalls, she whispered to herself. Then home before the children wake. Her fingers were numb, her breath shallow, but she refused to stop. Her late husband, Daniel Hart, had been charming once, handsome and full of promises. But gambling had taken everything, their savings, their home, and their reputation. When he died 6 months ago, he left behind nothing but debts and shame. The town pitied her but offered no help. The only work she could find was here, cleaning stables for a man she'd never spoken to. Colton Harrison, the richest rancher in the county. People said he was hard, cold as the Montana winter, a man who cared only for his land and his cattle. Emma didn't care about the rumors. She only cared about keeping her children alive. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal. She pulled her thin coat tighter and pushed a strand of hair from her face. The lantern flickered as the stable door creaked open. She froze. Heavy boots crunched against the frozen ground. Her heart pounded. She turned slowly, afraid of what, or who, she'd see. A tall figure stood in the doorway, backlit by the pale gray light of dawn. Snow clung to his hat and coat. His voice was deep but calm. "How long have you been coming here, Mrs. Hart?" Emma's breath caught. 2 weeks, sir," she whispered. Her hands twisted in the hem of her coat. She felt like a thief caught in the act. "Before dawn," he said, stepping closer. In this weather, his tone wasn't angry, just curious. "Why?" She lifted her chin, though her eyes filled with tears. "Because my children need to eat, Mr. Harrison." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded slowly, his eyes softening. "You deserve a better life than this." Emma didn't know how to answer. No one had spoken to her like that in months. Not with kindness. Not with understanding. "I've known you were coming," he said quietly. "For 2 weeks now. My foreman told me someone was cleaning the stalls before morning. I waited to see who it was. Now I know." She swallowed hard, unsure whether to apologize or run. "I meant no harm. I'll leave now, sir." He shook his head. "No, I don't want you to leave. I want you to come to the main house at noon." Her brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because I have an offer for you," he said simply. "And if you say yes, your children will never be cold or hungry again." Emma stared at him, her mind spinning. An offer? From a man like him? It didn't make sense. "What kind of offer?" she asked, voice trembling. He tipped his hat slightly. "We'll talk at noon. Inside where it's warm." Then he turned and walked away, his figure vanishing into the white storm. For a long time, Emma stood frozen, the words echoing in her mind. "Your children will never be cold or hungry again." She didn't know whether to feel hope or fear. When she finally left the stable, the sun had climbed weakly above the horizon. The snow crunched under her thin boots as she followed the narrow path toward town. Her cabin sat on the edge of the settlement, a small wooden structure leaning against the wind. Smoke rose weakly from the chimney. She stepped inside, the warmth from the dying fire barely noticeable. Her children were still asleep under thin blankets. Sarah, 7, her face too serious for her age, and little Tommy, only 4, curled beside her sister, clutching a ragged toy horse. Emma knelt beside them, brushing hair from Sarah's forehead. Her daughter stirred and opened her eyes. "Mama, you were out early again." "Yes, sweetheart," Emma said softly. "Go back to sleep." But Sarah didn't. She watched her mother quietly, already knowing more than a child should. That was the hardest part, the loss of innocence. Emma stood and stared around the cabin. The walls were patched with rags to keep out the wind. The floorboards creaked under her feet. The table was bare except for a chipped bowl and a cracked mug. Her chest tightened with shame. She had worked so hard to keep them fed, to keep them safe, but every day felt like a losing battle. Colton Harrison's words replayed in her mind again and again. Come to the main house at noon. Why would a man like him care about a woman like her? Maybe he needed help in the house. Maybe it was charity. Maybe it was something worse. She didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. She sat by the fire, rubbing her hands for warmth. Sarah came and sat beside her. "Mama, are we going to be all right?" Emma forced a smile. "Of course we are, my love." But when she looked at the small cupboard, empty except for a few crumbs, she knew the truth. They weren't all right. Not yet. Hours passed slowly. The sun climbed higher, casting pale light across the snow. Emma changed into her best dress, still worn and faded but clean. She tied her hair back and looked at her reflection in a small piece of mirror. Her face was thin, her eyes shadowed, but there was something fierce in her expression. Determination. She turned to Sarah and Tommy. "I have to go see someone. Stay here and keep the fire going." "Who, Mama?" Sarah asked. "Mr. Harrison," Emma said quietly. "He wants to talk to me." Sarah frowned. "The rancher? What does he want?" "I don't know," Emma admitted. "But maybe, just maybe, it'll be something good." As she stepped out into the snow again, the wind whipped her skirt around her legs. The world was silent except for the crunch of her boots. The ranch house stood tall in the distance, smoke curling from its chimney. She hesitated for a moment, staring at it. Her heart was pounding, not from the cold but from something else. Hope. Hope was dangerous, she knew. It could lift you high, only to drop you hard. But as she walked toward the big house, she couldn't stop the small, fragile spark that flickered inside her. She didn't know it yet, but Colton Harrison had been watching her for exactly 14 days. He'd seen her strength, her dignity, and the way she loved her children fiercely even when she had nothing left. And before the day was over, he would change her life forever. What could the richest man in Montana possibly want from a poor widow with nothing to offer but her desperation? The next day dawned clearer, though the air was still sharp enough to sting her lungs. Emma walked the long path to the Harrison Ranch with her heart pounding like a drum. Each crunch of snow beneath her boots brought her closer to an uncertain future. She'd spent the entire night turning over his words in her mind, unable to sleep. What could a man like Colton Harrison want with her? The question echoed as she climbed the steps to his grand house, the largest in the county. The front door opened before she could knock. Mrs. Callahan, the housekeeper, greeted her warmly, her plump face creased with kindness. "Mrs. Hart, come in, dear. Mr. Harrison's expecting you." Emma hesitated at the threshold, feeling small beneath the high ceilings and polished wood floors, her worn dress and scuffed boots a cruel contrast to the gleaming room. The smell of roasted coffee and pine logs filled the parlor. She sat on the edge of a chair near the fire, her fingers twisting her gloves nervously. When Colton entered, she stood so quickly she nearly knocked over her teacup. He was taller than she remembered, dressed neatly but without pretense, his coat removed and his sleeves rolled up, giving him a rugged, approachable air. "Please sit," he said, his tone kind but steady. She obeyed, though her hands trembled in her lap. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I'll get straight to it, Mrs. Hart. I have a proposition for you." Her pulse quickened. "A proposition?" "Yes," he said, pacing before the fire. I need a wife. Her eyes widened, confusion flooding her face. A wife, she echoed. Not for love, he added quickly, holding up a hand. At least not in the way people usually mean it. This would be an arrangement. A practical one. She sat in stunned silence, unsure if she'd heard correctly. He continued, voice calm and deliberate. I've been alone a long time. Since my wife passed 5 years ago. The ranch needs a woman's presence. Someone to manage the household, to be a hostess when business associates visit, to help keep things running smoothly. My staff does fine, but it isn't the same. People talk. A man in my position, unmarried, draws the wrong kind of attention. He paused, his eyes softening. But that's not the real reason. He took a breath. The truth is, I saw you working in that stable. You didn't know I was there. I watched you struggle and still hold your head high. You didn't beg or complain. You simply did what had to be done. That kind of strength, Mrs. Hart, that kind of dignity is rare. I thought, if I ever brought someone into this house again, I'd want it to be someone like you. Emma's throat went dry. Mr. Harrison, I don't understand. You can have anyone you want. Someone from town, someone respectable. I don't want respectable, he interrupted gently. I want real. I don't care for fancy manners or gossip. I care about honesty, loyalty, and heart. You have those in abundance. She stared at him, still not quite believing this was happening. What exactly are you offering? She asked cautiously. A marriage of convenience, he said plainly. You and your children would live here. You manage the house as you see fit. I'll see to all your debts. They'll be gone by sundown today, if you agree. Your children will have food, clothes, education, security. There will be no expectations beyond companionship and respect. Separate bedrooms. No intimacy unless you choose it. After 1 year, if you're unhappy, you'll leave with a settlement enough to live comfortably for life. Emma's hands gripped the edge of the chair. Why would you do this for me? She whispered. Because I can, he said simply. And because you deserve a chance to live, not just survive. The room fell silent except for the crackle of the fire. Emma felt the tears threaten but blinked them back. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, he said softly. Take 24 hours. Talk to your children. Then come back tomorrow and tell me your decision. She nodded slowly, still dazed. He walked her to the door himself, ignoring the surprised looks of his staff. When he opened it for her, he added quietly, whatever you decide, Mrs. Hart, I'll respect it. She looked up at him, snowflakes landing in her hair, and for the first time in months, she felt something warm bloom in her chest, hope. That night, back in her cabin, she lit a small fire and sat her children down. Sarah's brow furrowed as she listened, while Tommy's eyes shone with innocent excitement. He said he wants to marry you? Sarah asked, disbelief and suspicion lacing her young voice. Yes, Emma admitted softly, but not like you think. It's an arrangement. He'd take care of us, and I'd help with his household. We'd have food, warmth, safety. Tommy tugged at her sleeve. Does that mean we'll have meat again? And milk? Emma smiled faintly. Yes, sweetheart. Every day. Sarah crossed her arms. But what does he want from you, Mama? People don't just give things away. The question hit deep. Emma sighed, brushing her daughter's hair. He said he doesn't want anything except honesty and company. I think he's lonely. Sarah, maybe as lonely as we are. Sarah was quiet a long time before saying, I just don't want you to get hurt again. Emma's heart broke a little. Neither do I, she whispered. That night, long after the children were asleep, Emma pulled on her shawl and stepped out into the snow. She walked to the small cemetery where her husband was buried. The wind cut through her thin dress, but she hardly felt it. Daniel, she murmured, kneeling by the grave. I don't know if you'd understand this. Maybe you'd call it betrayal. But I can't keep living like this, watching our children go hungry, begging for scraps of work. He's offering them a life I can't give. I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing it for them. Her voice broke. Forgive me. She stood, the moonlight glinting off her tears, and whispered, Tomorrow, I'll say yes. The following day was clear and bright. Emma dressed in her best, a faded blue dress, mended at the seams, and walked back to Harrison Ranch. When Colton opened the door, she met his eyes steadily. "I've made my decision," she said. "I'll accept your offer." He nodded once, the corner of his mouth softening into something like relief. "Then we'll go to the courthouse this afternoon." She blinked, surprised by his efficiency, but didn't protest. By sunset, they were married. The ceremony was brief, just the town clerk and Mrs. Callahan as witnesses. Emma wore a borrowed cream dress that hung loosely on her frame, her hands trembling as she held the small bouquet of winter berries Colton had brought. When the clerk asked if she took this man as her husband, her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I do." When it was his turn, Colton's voice wavered slightly. "I do." There was no kiss, only a quiet nod and a shared glance heavy with unspoken understanding. They rode back to the ranch together in a covered wagon. Tommy fell asleep against Emma's shoulder while Sarah watched the passing snow, wary but curious. The ranch hands tipped their hats politely as they arrived, whispering among themselves. Mrs. Callahan greeted them with tears in her eyes and warm stew on the stove. It was the first real meal Emma and her children had eaten in weeks. Later, Colton showed Emma to her new room, a large, warm space with soft linens and a window overlooking the fields. "This door," he said, pointing to a side door near the bed, "connects to my room. It stays locked unless you decide otherwise." "Always your choice, Emma." She nodded, struck silent by his gentleness. That night, after the children were asleep in their new rooms, Emma lay awake in the soft bed. The silence felt strange. No wind whistling through cracks, no creaking boards, no gnawing hunger in her belly. Just quiet and the hum of thoughts she couldn't silence. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? Her children would be safe. They would have a future. Still, as she stared at the ceiling, her heart ached with confusion. She didn't know this man, not really. Yet there was something in his eyes when he looked at her, something steady, something that made her want to believe. Across the hall, in his own room, Colton lay awake too, staring at the ceiling. The house felt different now, alive again. He could hear faint laughter from Tommy's room earlier, the first child's laughter to echo in these halls in years. He closed his eyes and smiled slightly. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about loss. He was thinking about beginnings. Two strangers, now husband and wife, separated by a locked door and an ocean of uncertainty. Can a marriage built on need, rather than love, ever become real? The first weeks of their marriage passed like a slow thaw after a long winter, quiet and cautious at first. Emma and Colton moved around each other like two people afraid to step on something fragile. Every morning, the house woke to the same careful pattern. Emma rose before the sun, as she always had, but now she walked across polished floors instead of cold, uneven boards. She checked on Sarah and Tommy, smiled when she saw them sleeping in warm beds, then went downstairs to help Mrs. Callahan with breakfast. At first, the meals were stiff and formal. Emma sat at one end of the long table, Colton at the other, a full pot of coffee, eggs, bread, and bacon between them, and words hanging unsaid in the air. Sarah sat straight-backed, wary and watchful, while Tommy swung his legs and tried not to spill anything. But slowly, almost without Emma noticing when it started, the sharp edges began to soften. Colton stopped sitting so far away and chose the chair beside Emma instead. He started asking the children small questions about their favorite books, what games they liked, whether they had ever ridden a horse. Sarah answered carefully at first, as if testing him, while Tommy dove right in, eager and open. Emma listened, her heart aching and swelling at the same time as she watched her children slowly relax in his presence. Days on the ranch followed a steady rhythm. After breakfast, Colton rode out with the ranch hands, checking fences and cattle, while Emma learned the rhythms of the big house. At first, she felt like a guest who might be sent away at any moment. But Mrs. Callahan quickly drew her in, showing her where linens were kept, how supplies were ordered, which rooms needed the most attention, and which guests liked extra sugar in their tea when they visited. Emma began adding small touches almost by instinct. She moved a stiff chair closer to the fireplace to make room for a reading nook. She placed a simple vase of dried wildflowers on the dining table. She washed and aired out curtains that had hung heavy and dusty for years. Bit by bit, the house began to feel less like a monument and more like a home. The staff noticed. So did Colton. He would walk in from the cold, shake the snow from his coat, and pause a little longer in the entryway, sensing something different in the air. Warm bread baking, children's laughter drifting from upstairs, a quilt left neatly folded over the back of a chair, hand-stitched with simple, careful patterns. In the afternoons, Emma often watched through the window as Colton spent time with the children. He called Tommy down a barn, lifting him onto a gentle old gelding. "Hands on the horns, son," he said calmly, walking beside the horse and keeping a strong hold on the reins. Tommy's eyes shone with excitement and pride. "Look, Mama," he yelled toward the house. Emma, standing at the window, pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her throat tighten. No one had ever taken such patience with her boy like that, speaking to him with respect instead of treating him as a burden. With Sarah, things moved more slowly. She was cautious, sharp-eyed, always waiting for the moment when kindness turned into disappointment. Colton never pushed her. Instead, he brought books from his library, histories, adventure stories, simple science texts, and left them on the table near where she liked to sit. "You're welcome to borrow anything you like," he told her. "If you have questions, I'd be glad to talk about them." For days, she ignored the offer. Then one evening, Emma found her at the table, chewing her lip as she stared at a page she didn't understand. Colton sat down across from her and gently explained the words, treating her like an equal, not a child to be brushed aside. Emma watched from the doorway, hidden as Sarah's stiff shoulders slowly dropped and a small smile touched her lips. The house grew warmer in other ways, too. One afternoon, Emma stood in the kitchen kneading bread beside Mrs. Callahan, flour dusting her hands and cheeks. They talked about simple things, recipes, weather, sewing, and for the first time in a long while, Emma laughed. Not a nervous, forced laugh, but a real one, light and surprised. Colton, passing by the open door, stopped when he heard it. The sound curled around his chest like sunlight after a long winter. He didn't step in or interrupt. He just stood there for a moment, unseen, letting the warmth of it sink in before he walked on. As the weeks became months, the distance between Emma and Colton shrank in small, almost invisible ways. Their hands brushed when they passed plates at dinner. When she moved past him in a narrow hallway, his scent, soap, leather, and clean hay, stayed with her longer than it should have. One evening, she stumbled slightly on a loose stair, and his hand shot out to steady her. For a moment, they stood close, their faces only inches apart. Her heart hammered. His eyes searched hers, not with hunger or demand, but with quiet concern. "You all right?" he asked softly. "Yes," she breathed, stepping back. The moment passed, but it left a trace behind, something that stayed with both of them long after. Before long, Emma's new role as mistress of the house was put to the test. Colton announced they would be hosting a dinner for several important cattle buyers and local businessmen. The words made her stomach twist. She had never been a hostess in a grand home. Her old life had been small and simple, full of modest gatherings and rough laughter, not polished conversation and sharp eyes. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted to him quietly the night before the event. "You'll be fine," he said, his voice steady and certain. "You have more sense and grace than anyone I know. Just be yourself." His faith in her settled over her like a cloak. The night of the dinner, the house sparkled with lamplight. The table was laid with fine china and polished silver. Emma wore a simple dress in soft blue that Mrs. Callahan had helped her alter, and though it was not new, it fit her well and brought out the color in her eyes. As guests arrived, Emma greeted them at the door, her hands only slightly trembling. She listened more than she spoke, offered warm smiles, and made sure no one's plate or glass sat empty for long. When one of the ranchers' wives made a cutting comment about quick marriages and convenient arrangements, Emma felt the sting but kept her composure, answering with quiet dignity instead of anger. She didn't notice the way Colton's jaw tightened from across the room, or how his eyes followed her as she moved, proud and protective. Later, when the guest had gone and the house was finally quiet, Emma stood in the dining room, staring at the empty chairs and half-melted candles. Her shoulders sagged with exhaustion. She almost jumped when Colton spoke from the doorway. "You were perfect tonight," he said simply. She shook her head. "I was terrified." He stepped closer, his voice gentle. "You didn't show it." She gave a small, tired smile. "I'm good at hiding fear." There was a pause, and then he said softly, "You don't have to." "Not with me." Her eyes met his, and something unspoken passed between them. Something deep and tender that neither of them had planned for. The turning point came late one night when Emma couldn't sleep. The house was silent, the halls dim. She went downstairs to warm herself some milk, her feet light on the wooden steps. Halfway to the kitchen, she noticed a faint glow coming from the study. The door was slightly open. Curiosity tugged at her. She moved closer and peered inside. Colton sat in a chair by the fire, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his shoulders bent slightly forward. His eyes were fixed on a painting above the mantel, a portrait of a young woman with kind eyes and a soft smile, one hand resting gently on a rounded belly. Emma realized with a jolt that this must be his late wife. His face, usually controlled and calm, was open in that moment, lined with grief and something like regret. She watched as he lifted his hand to his face and wiped at his eyes quickly, as if ashamed of the tears. Her heart squeezed. She had not meant to spy, and she stepped back quietly before he could see her. But the image stayed with her all night. The strong rancher alone in the dark, holding on to a ghost. A few days later, Emma was in the garden, kneeling in the cold earth, planning where spring vegetables would go once the snow melted. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Colton watching her. "I saw you," she said softly before she could stop herself. "The other night, in the study, looking at her portrait." For a moment his expression shuddered, like a door closing. "I'm sorry," she added quickly. "I didn't mean to intrude on your privacy." He shook his head. "You didn't intrude. I'm just not used to anyone noticing me." She looked at him, really looked, and said quietly, "I notice everything about you." The word surprised them both. He sat on the edge of the low stone wall, the winter sun pale above them. Slowly, he began to talk. He told her about his wife, Catherine, about how kind she had been, how excited they'd both been about the baby she carried, how she and the child had both died in childbirth, leaving him alone in a house that suddenly felt too large and too quiet. "I shut the world out after that," he admitted. "I thought it was easier to feel nothing than to risk feeling that kind of pain again." Emma listened, her heart aching for him. Then, in a low voice, she told him about Daniel, about the gambling, the lies, the debts, about the shame of watching her life fall apart one bad decision at a time. "When he died, I felt guilty," she said. "Guilty for being relieved and guilty for being angry. I thought it meant there was something wrong with me." Colton shook his head. "There is nothing wrong with you, Emma. You did what you had to do to survive. You have nothing to be ashamed of." She held his gaze and replied softly, "Neither do you. Grief isn't weakness." Something settled between them then, a shared understanding, a quiet bond. They were no longer just two people tied together by need. They were becoming something more. Friends, confidants, partners in pain and in healing. The days rolled forward toward Christmas, and the ranch began to glow with a softer light. Emma, with the help of the children and staff, decorated the house with simple evergreen garlands, paper chains, and candles in the windows. It was the first Christmas she had allowed herself to feel anything but dread since Daniel's death. On Christmas Eve, they all rode into town for the church service. They entered together, Colton, Emma, Sarah, and Tommy, and the town's eyes followed them. Whispers started as they walked down the aisle to a pew, but Emma held her head high. During the hymn, she glanced sideways and saw Sarah quietly slip her small hand into Colton's. He looked down, surprised, then closed his fingers around hers. Emma's eyes stung with tears, and she sang the rest of the hymn with a lump in her throat. Walking home through the snow afterward, the four of them looked, for all the world, like a real family. Christmas morning came with laughter instead of fear. Tommy rushed down the stairs to find a small pony waiting for him in the stable, his joy so loud it echoed off the rafters. Sarah opened a set of heavy books, encyclopedias and novels, that she had admired in the library, her eyes shining with gratitude and wonder. Emma found a package on her chair, a soft blue wool shawl, finer than anything she'd ever owned. A note in Colton's careful handwriting said, "I noticed you were always cold in the mornings." She smiled, pulling it around her shoulders, warmed as much by the thought as by the wool. For Colton, Emma had embroidered a set of handkerchiefs with his initials, simple but carefully made. "I noticed you never seemed to have any," she said, her eyes twinkling. They shared a small, shy smile, the kind that said more than words could. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat together on the front porch, wrapped in blankets against the crisp air. Snow glittered under the moonlight, and the sky was full of stars. "This is the best Christmas I've had in 5 years," Colton said quietly. "Me too," Emma replied. "The best and longer than that." His hand found hers under the shared blanket, warm and steady. She didn't pull away. They sat like that, side by side, watching their breath rise in small clouds, the silence between them comfortable and full. When he walked her to her bedroom door, he lingered for a moment, standing a little too close. "Emma," he began, but then stopped, swallowing whatever he had been about to say. "Good night, Mrs. Harrison," he finished instead, the title feeling strangely wrong now. "Good night, Colton," she answered, her voice soft. She closed the door gently, her heart racing. That night, they both lay awake on opposite sides of the locked connecting door, staring into the darkness, each thinking of the other, each wondering how long they could go on pretending this marriage was only an arrangement. They're falling in love, but neither has admitted it, both trapped by the terms of their agreement and their fear of being hurt again. How long can they pretend this marriage is just business? Late January came with a warning in the sky, a hard gray line on the horizon, and a wind that bit deeper than it had all winter. And by mid-afternoon, the worst blizzard in a decade hit the Harrison Ranch without mercy. The snow came fast and sideways, driven by a screaming wind that shook the windows and rattled the doors. Inside the house, Emma paced from room to room, checking on Sarah and Tommy, adding extra wood to the fire, trying to act calm so they would not see how scared she really was. But every time she passed a window, her eyes searched the white world outside, looking for any sign of Colton. He and the ranch hands had gone out early to move the cattle to lower pastures before the storm, and though they were used to harsh weather, this storm felt different, wild and dangerous, like something that could take a man and not give him back. Hours crawled by. One by one, the ranch hands staggered into the house, faces red with cold, coats crusted with ice, breathing hard and shaking snow from their hats. Emma rushed to the mudroom, counting each man as he came in, her heart dropping a little more with every name that wasn't his. "Where's Mr. Harrison?" she asked, voice tight. The foreman, a weathered man named Hank, took off his hat and looked at her with worry in his eyes. "Boss went back for some stranded calves in the north pasture," he said. "That was over 2 hours ago now." Emma felt the room tilt. The north pasture was 3 miles away in good weather. In a storm like this, it might as well have been the other side of the world. Hank put a hand on her shoulder. Ma'am, I told him it was too dangerous, but you know him. He said he wouldn't leave them to freeze. The words hit her like a blow, and in that moment, something in her chest cracked open. A clear, painful thought rose above the noise of her fear. I love him. Dear God, I love him. I can't lose him. Hank and the others tried to convince her to wait, to trust that Colton would find his way back. But every time she looked out the window and saw nothing but swirling white, panic tightened its grip. Finally, she couldn't stand it any longer. She grabbed a heavy coat from the hook, pulled on boots and mittens, and wrapped her shawl tight. Mrs. Harrison, you can't go out in that, Mrs. Callahan cried, hurrying after her. You'll never find him. Emma tied a thick scarf around her face, her eyes shining with fierce determination. I have to try, she said. If it were me out there, he wouldn't sit by the fire and wait. Before anyone could stop her, she grabbed a lantern and a coil of rope and stepped out into the storm. The wind slammed into her like a wall, pushing her back, snatching tears from her eyes and freezing them on her lashes. Snow stung her cheeks like needles. She bent forward and forced herself on, following the fence line because it was the only guide in the white chaos. The world was narrowed to the small circle of light from her lantern and the sound of her own voice as she called his name again and again. Colton, Colton. Her words were ripped away by the wind, but she kept shouting until her throat burned. Each step through the waist-deep drifts felt heavier than the last, her legs shaking, her fingers numb despite the mittens. But the fear of losing him drove her on with a strength she didn't know she had. At last, through the blur of snow, she saw a dark shape slumped against a fence post. Her heart lurched. She stumbled forward and dropped to her knees beside him. It was Colton. His coat was caked with ice, his hat gone, his face pale and still. Two small calves were huddled near him, pressed in close as if they knew he had been their only shield against the wind. Colton, she gasped, shaking his shoulder. For a moment there was nothing. Then his eyelids fluttered and he blinked at her, eyes glassy with cold and exhaustion. Emma, he rasped, you shouldn't be here. Too dangerous. Tears blurred her vision, freezing on her lashes. Hush, she said, voice breaking. I'm taking you home. She worked with shaking hands, looping the rope around his chest and tying the other into the fence so they wouldn't lose their way. She tugged him to his feet, though his legs barely held him, and pulled his arm over her shoulders, taking as much of his weight as she could. Step by step, leaning on each other, they fought their way back along the fence line, the storm trying to shove them down with every gust. Her muscles burned, her lungs ached, but the thought of him lying cold and still in the snow pushed her onward. By the time they reached the house, she was staggering, her legs ready to buckle, her fingers barely able to twist the knob, but the door flew open and strong arms pulled them both inside. The calves were dragged to shelter, and voices shouted for the doctor, for blankets, for hot water. Emma refused to leave his side. They stripped off his frozen coat, his boots, his gloves, his skin red and raw from the cold, his fingertips already white with early frostbite. The doctor arrived, barking orders, wrapping him in warm blankets, rubbing his hands and feet, pouring warm broth between his lips. All through it, Emma sat beside the bed, clutching his hand as if letting go would mean losing him forever. She prayed in a way she hadn't prayed in years, whispering into the quiet moments between the doctor's movements. Please, God, don't take him. Not him. Not now. Hours passed. The fire roared in the hearth, but Colton's skin stayed cold and clammy, his breath shallow. Fever followed the cold, burning through him now that he was safe from the storm. His body shook, his face slick with sweat. Emma mopped his brow with a cool cloth, her own body aching with fatigue, but she refused to rest. Mrs. Callahan brought her tea again and again, urging her to sleep, but she only shook her head. At one point, the older woman rested a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. You love him, don't you, dear? She asked softly. Emma stared at Colton's face, at the man who had changed her life with a single offer in a cold stable, and finally whispered, "Yes, with everything in me, but he doesn't love me." This was an arrangement. Mrs. Callahan smiled the soft, knowing smile of someone who had watched more than she'd spoken. "Oh, child," she said, "everyone in this house can see it except the two of you." Later that night, when the fever was at its worst, Colton began to murmur in his sleep, his words broken and raw. "Emma," he whispered hoarsely, his hand twitching in hers. "Emma, can't lose you. Not you too. Not Emma." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she leaned closer, her heart pounding. "I'm right here," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." He stirred, eyes still closed, his voice rough and honest in his delirium. "Need to tell her," he muttered. "Need her to know. Love her. Always loved her." Emma's breath caught. The room dropped away until there was nothing but his face and those words echoing in her chest. Love her. Always loved her. In that moment, her heart broke and healed all at once. As dawn crept in, the fever finally broke, leaving Colton pale and exhausted but breathing more evenly. Emma, still holding his hand, had drifted into a shallow, uncomfortable sleep in the chair by his bed, her head resting on the edge of the mattress. When he woke at last, the first thing he saw was her face, worn and tear-streaked, her hand still wrapped firmly around his. For a long moment, he just watched her, feeling the weight of what had almost happened, feeling the echo of the storm and the warmth of her fingers. Slowly, he reached up with his free hand and brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, his touch feather-light. She woke with a small start, lifting her head and meeting his gaze. Relief flooded her features. "You're awake," she breathed. "Thank God." His voice was rough but steady. "You came for me," he said. "Into that storm." She nodded, a faint, shy smile tugging at her lips despite her exhaustion. "Of course I did," she said. I couldn't lose you." His eyes searched hers, and for a second it felt like everything else in the world had gone quiet. "Emma, I need to tell you something important," he began, his voice soft but full of weight. But before he could say more, the doctor bustled in, checking his pulse, his wounds, his temperature, filling the room with practical questions and instructions, and the moment slipped away like snow melting in the sun. 2 weeks later, when the worst of winter had passed and Colton was strong enough to walk without tiring, the town held its first big social gathering of the season at the community hall. It was meant to celebrate surviving the storm and to talk business. But for Emma, it felt like stepping into a lion's den. This was the first time she would appear publicly as Mrs. Harrison in a room full of people who loved gossip more than the truth. She wore a simple but well-fitted dress that Mrs. Callahan had helped her prepare, her hair pinned neatly, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. As they entered together, Colton's arm offered firmly to her. Conversations dipped and eyes followed them. Emma held her head high, but inside her stomach churned. Among the polished crowd stood Victoria Blackwood, a wealthy widow who had long set her sights on Colton. Tall, elegant, and dressed in the latest fashion from back east, she approached with a practiced smile that did not reach her eyes. "Colton," she purred, laying a hand lightly on his arm. "So good to see you back on your feet. We were all so worried." Her gaze slid to Emma, cool and assessing. "And this must be the new Mrs. Harrison," she added, the words smooth but edged. "How charitable of you, Colton, to take in a poor woman and her children." Emma's cheeks burned, but she forced a polite smile. "I'm honored to meet you," she said quietly. Victoria's eyes sharpened. "Oh, I'm sure the arrangement suits everyone," she went on in a voice meant to carry just enough to reach nearby ears. "Security for her, companionship for you. People do what they must in these harsh times, don't they?" The ladies around her tittered behind their gloved hands. Colton was pulled away by a group of businessmen before he could hear the exchange, leaving Emma in the circle of soft, poisonous smiles. The questions came like little cuts. "It all happened so quickly, didn't it?" one woman said sweetly. Such a short time between your husband's passing and this new marriage. Another leaned in. Some might say you were quite clever, my dear, securing such a match. A rich widower, no less. Why? Some women wait years for such an opportunity. Victoria's voice cut through again, sugar over steel. We all know how lonely grief can make a man, she said, and how resourceful some women can be when survival is at stake. The implication was clear and cruel, that Emma had trapped him, taken advantage of his loneliness, maybe even used her situation to manipulate him. Each word was a stone added to the weight already on Emma's heart. She felt her throat close, her hands shaking. She tried to answer with dignity, but the room began to blur. At last, unable to bear another word, she murmured an excuse and hurried outside, the cold night air hitting her like a slap. She stood alone under the stars, tears freezing on her cheeks as she struggled to catch her breath. All her old fears roared back to life. The shame from her past, the whispers, the feeling that she did not belong in this world of polished people and measured words. She pressed a hand to her stomach, fighting panic. She didn't hear the door open behind her until a familiar voice said gently, "Emma." She turned to see Colton standing in the doorway, concern etched across his face. "What happened?" he asked, stepping closer. "Who hurt you?" She hesitated, but the pain and humiliation were too much to keep inside. In a shaking voice, she told him everything. Victoria's words, the gossip, the suggestions that she had trapped him, the way they called her a charity case. As she spoke, his expression changed. Calm, controlled Colton Harrison, who rarely raised his voice, grew visibly furious, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing. "Stay here," he said quietly, his voice low and dangerous. "Please," she whispered, grabbing his sleeve. "Don't make it worse." He gently took her hand from his arm and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, shocking her into silence. "I won't make it worse," he said, "but I will make it right." He strode back into the hall, Emma following at a distance, her heart hammering. The music dimmed as people noticed his expression and turned to watch. He walked straight to Victoria, who was surrounded by her circle of admirers, and stopped in front of her. The room went quiet. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice clear and steady, carrying easily in the hush. "You spoke cruelly about my wife." He let the word wife hang in the air, heavy and deliberate. "The woman I love. The woman who saved my life in that blizzard." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, Emma's own breath catching in her chest. "I'll ask you once to apologize," he continued. "And if you can't manage that basic decency, I'll ask you to leave." Victoria's face flushed deep red, caught between anger and embarrassment. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her usual smooth words failing her under the weight of the room's attention. Colton did not look away. Then he turned slightly, his voice rising so all could hear. "Let me be very clear to everyone here," he said. "Emma is not my charity. She is not my arrangement. She is my wife in every sense that matters. I am the one who is grateful every single day that she chose me." Murmurs swept through the hall, some stunned, some approving. Emma stood frozen, tears hot in her eyes. He had said it, plainly, publicly, with no room for doubt. "The woman I love." As the moment stretched, Colton reached for Emma's hand, finding her at the edge of the crowd, and laced his fingers through hers with quiet certainty. "We're going home," he said softly to her, ignoring the stares, the whispers, the shifting faces around them. She let him lead her out into the night, her heart racing, her mind spinning. Every part of her wanted to believe what he had said, to take those words and hold them close, but doubt still clung to her like shadows. Did he say just to defend her, to silence the gossip, or because it was truly, deeply real? As the carriage rolled away from the hall and the lights of town faded behind them, Emma sat beside him, their hands still joined, and wondered if the love he had declared in front of everyone was strong enough to quiet the fear that had lived in her heart for so long. He has declared his love in front of the entire town, but Emma's scars run deep. Was it a moment of protection and pride, or the truth of his heart at last? And will she dare to believe it? The carriage ride home from the social was quiet at first, the sound of the wheels over packed snow the only thing between them. But the air inside felt thick with all the words Emma couldn't say, her hand still curled in his where he had taken it in front of everyone. Her heart beat so hard it almost hurt. Finally, unable to hold it in any longer, she turned slightly toward him in the dim lamplight. "Did you mean it?" she asked, her voice soft but shaking. "What you said back there?" His answer came without a pause, firm and clear. Every single word. She swallowed, her eyes burning. "You said you loved me," she whispered, as if saying the words out loud might make them vanish. He looked straight at her. No joke, no deflection, only truth. "I do," he said simply. "I love you, Emma." It felt like the world stopped moving for a moment. She had dreamed of hearing those words, feared them, doubted them, and now they were here, sitting between them like something fragile and holy. "When?" she managed, barely above a breath. "When did you start?" He let out a long, slow breath, his gaze dropping for a moment as if he were searching for the right memory. "Honestly," he said, "that morning in the stable. The first time I saw you on your knees in the snow, working until your hands bled just to keep your children fed. You were freezing, tired, and still you held your head high. I remember thinking I had never seen anyone so strong, not because of your face or your dress, but because of the way you refused to give up." His voice softened. "I married you because I couldn't stand watching you suffer another day. I told myself it was practical, a solution. But I fell in love slowly, watching you laugh with your children in this house, listening to the way you read them stories at night, seeing the way you brought warmth back into these rooms. You took a place that felt like a mausoleum and turned it into a home." Her cheeks were wet with tears now, and she didn't even try to hide them. "What if I'm not enough?" she whispered. "What if I can't be what you need? You had a life before me. You loved someone before me." He shook his head, reaching up to gently thumb away one of the tears on her cheek. "You are everything I never knew I needed," he said. "I thought my life was over. I thought love was behind me. Then you came into that stable with your lantern and your stubbornness and your cracked gloves, and you turned everything I thought I knew upside down. You're enough, Emma. More than enough." Something inside her broke open. "I love you too," she confessed in a rush, the dam finally giving way. "I don't know when it started. Maybe when you let Tommy ride that old horse and walked beside him for an hour, even though you were tired. Maybe when I saw you bring books for Sarah without making her feel small. Maybe when you told me I had nothing to be ashamed of. Or maybe when you went out into that storm for those calves, and I realized the thought of losing you hurt worse than any hunger I'd ever known. All I know now is that I love you, and it scares me." He smiled, pained but tender. "Why does it scare you?" She looked down at their joined hands. "Because my first husband died and left me with nothing but debts and shame," she said. "Because every time I've reached for something good, it's been taken away. I'm afraid if I let myself be happy, if I really believe this is real, it'll vanish. And I don't know if I can survive that again." He leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "I can't promise I'll never die," he said. "No one can. But I can promise this. Every day I have, I will love you. I will choose you. I will wake up and choose you again. Not out of duty, not out of pity, but because you're the only woman I want." By the time the carriage rolled into the yard, the fear in Emma's chest had loosened its grip, replaced by a shaky, fragile joy. Inside the house, all was quiet. The children were asleep, the lamps turned low. In the entryway, snow still clung to the hems of their coats, melting slowly into small puddles on the floor. Colton reached for her hand again. "Emma," he said softly, "may I kiss you? Not as the man who made you an offer in a stable, but as your husband, as the man who loves you." Her heart flipped. She nodded, unable to find her voice. He stepped closer, cupped her face in his hands as if she were something precious, and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss started gentle, testing, full of all the things they had not said until tonight. It deepened as she leaned into him, her hands gripping the front of his coat, years of loneliness melting away for both of them. When they finally parted, foreheads touching, they were both breathless. "I've wanted to do that since Christmas," he confessed with a small, crooked smile. She laughed through her tears. "Me too," she admitted. Every single day, together, they walked upstairs, stopping at her bedroom door, the door that had always been the boundary between what they were and what they could be. Her hand shook as she reached for the lock on the connecting door between their rooms. She hesitated, looking back at him. He didn't push, didn't move closer, just waited, his eyes steady and full of respect. "Your choice," he said softly. "Always your choice." Her fingers tightened around the key. For the first time in years, her choice was not about survival, but about love. She turned the key. The lock clicked, loud and clear in the quiet hallway. She opened the door and looked up at him. "I'm ready," she said, her voice trembling but sure. "If you are." His answer was simple. "Emma," he whispered, stepping through the doorway, "I've been ready since the day I married you." The weeks that followed were some of the sweetest of Emma's life. The house, once rich with only the smell of wood and leather, now seemed full of laughter, shared looks, quiet touches. Where there had been caution, there was now ease. Where there had been formality, there was now comfort. They moved through their days as partners, not just in name, but in truth. They still had separate tasks. He oversaw the cattle and land. She managed the household and children, but the line between his world and hers began to blur. He asked for her opinions on ranch matters, listening with real interest when she made suggestions about saving costs or improving storage. She trusted his judgment more deeply now, knowing it was not rooted in pride, but in a desire to protect what they were building together. Evenings became their favorite time. After supper, they sat by the fire while Sarah read aloud or Tommy played on the floor with carved wooden animals. Sometimes, when the children were asleep, Emma and Colton would stay downstairs a little longer, talking about small things, favorite childhood memories, little dreams for the future. He told her about the land he hoped to buy someday, the breeding program he wanted to start. She told him about her wish for Sarah to get a real education and for Tommy to never know the sharp ache of hunger again. More than once, she caught herself looking at him and thinking, "This is my life now. This is my home. This is my husband." And the thought filled her with a quiet joy she had never known. But life, as she had learned, rarely stayed simple for long. One ordinary Tuesday, as the sky outside shifted towards spring, a letter arrived from a distant banking town. Emma almost didn't open it, assuming it was another bill she couldn't pay or a notice she no longer needed to worry about now that her debts were gone. But when she unfolded the paper and started to read, the color drained from her face. The letter was from a bank that had finally tracked her down. Before his death, Daniel had once again signed papers in her name, this time without her knowledge, forging her signature on a sizable loan. Legally, she was responsible for it. The debt, with interest, was now huge, $5,000. Her hands shook so badly she could hardly keep hold of the letter. $5,000. Enough to buy land. Enough to ruin a ranch. Panic roared through her. Old shame rose like a storm. She thought of the north pasture, the cattle, the house, all the men who worked here and their families who depended on this ranch. Her chest tightened, her breath coming short and fast. She was still standing there, pale and trembling, when Colton walked in and saw her face. In an instant, he crossed the room. "Emma, what is it?" he asked, voice full of concern. She tried to speak, but no words came at first. Finally, she thrust the letter toward him with shaking hands. He took it, scanned the contents, and his jaw clenched. "That bastard," he muttered under his breath, eyes darkening. "He forged your signature." Tears spilled over as Emma choked out. I didn't know Colton. I swear to God, I didn't know. I would never. He cut her off gently but firmly. Emma, I believe you. This isn't your doing. His faith in her should have comforted her, but the fear was too strong. It's $5,000, she said, almost choking on the number. That kind of debt could destroy the ranch. You pay my other debts, and now this is too much. I have to leave. He stared at her like she'd spoken nonsense. What are you talking about? She backed away, shaking her head. If I go, they can't touch you or your land. You can say I deceived you, that you didn't know. This place, your family's land, it shouldn't suffer because of my past. Because of him, his face hardened with a rare anger. Not at her, but at the situation itself. You are not leaving, he said, each word slow and deliberate. I already lost one family. I will not let fear and a dead man's lies take this one from me. She sobbed, the words tumbling out. You married me to save me from poverty, and now I've brought ruin with me. I won't let that happen. I won't let you pay this price. He stepped forward, taking her shoulders in his hands, forcing her to look at him. Listen to me. I did not marry you to be your savior. I married you because I wanted you, because I love you. This, he shook the letter slightly, is ink on paper. You, Sarah, Tommy, you're my family. There is no comparison. Despite his words, Emma could not shake the guilt. She cried herself to sleep that night. Her body curled toward his arms wrapped around her as if he could shield her from the world with sheer will. In the dark, she whispered, I can't let you lose everything you've built. His answer came quietly against her hair. You are not something that happened to me, Emma. You are my choice. I will prove that to you, if it takes everything I have. The next morning before dawn, Colton rose quietly, kissed her forehead, and slipped out of bed. When she woke, his side was empty and cooling, and panic darted through her. She dressed quickly, went downstairs, and found Hank saddling a horse. Where is he going? She asked, her voice tight. Town, Hank said. Bank opens early on Tuesdays. He told me he had business to settle. Her stomach dropped. What is he going to do? She whispered. Hank hesitated, then answered. He didn't say. But I've worked for that man long enough to know he won't come back half done. All day, Emma paced the house, unable to eat, unable to sit still. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind against the windows made her jump. She imagined him signing away everything, losing land, losing cattle, all because of her. By the time she saw his horse returning at dusk, her hands were cold despite the fire. She ran outside, skirts catching in the wind, and met him as he dismounted. His face was tired but calm, his eyes steady. What did you do? She demanded, her voice breaking. Please tell me you didn't gamble this ranch away from me. He reached into his coat and pulled out a stack of official papers, the bank seal stamped in bold ink. On the top page, in thick letters, were the words paid in full. He handed them to her. It's done, he said. The debt is gone. She stared at the words, then up at him. How, she asked. Where did you get that kind of money? He shrugged lightly, though his eyes held deep emotion. I sold the north pasture, he said. The 500 acres my grandfather first homesteaded. Her breath left her body. No, she whispered, horror and heartbreak mixing in her chest. Colton, no. That land has been in your family for 50 years. You told me stories about it. He nodded. I know, but it was land. You're my wife. There was no real choice to make. Her knees almost gave way, and she clutched the papers to her chest. I'm not worth that much, she sobbed. I'm not worth your legacy. He stepped forward, pulling her into his arms as she broke down completely, years of shame and fear pouring out in a flood of tears. You are worth everything I have and more, he said into her hair. Don't you see? The past is dirt and stone and ink on paper. You are flesh and blood and heart. I chose you. I will keep choosing you. That night, after her tears had slowed and they sat together in the quiet parlor, the fire low and warm, Emma lifted her head from his shoulder eyes red but clear. "Colton," she said softly, "I want to renew our vows." He blinked, surprised. "Our vows?" She nodded. "When we first married, it was an agreement, a trade. You offered me safety. I offered you a name and a home to fill. We said the right words, but my heart was still half buried in fear. Yours was still buried in grief. I want to stand before you again, not as the woman you rescued, but as the woman who loves you. I want to marry you a second time, not because we need to, but because we choose to." His throat worked as he swallowed hard, emotion shining plainly in his eyes. "You want to marry me again," he said slowly, "knowing everything you know now? Knowing I can be stubborn and foolish and reckless enough to sell half my land in one morning?" She gave a wet little laugh. "Yes," she said, "because you're also the man who went into a blizzard for a couple of calves, and the man who chose me over 50 years of family history. I want us to say our vows again with open eyes and open hearts. For love this time. Only love." He took her hands in his, squeezing them gently. "Nothing," he said in a rough voice, "would make me happier." They will stand together and speak their vows again, this time with hearts laid bare and no derangement between them. Only love. But even as they plan their new beginning, life has one last test waiting to prove just how deep that love truly runs. The evening of their vow renewal came soft and golden, the Montana sky painted with streaks of pink and orange as the sun sank low over the hills, and the garden at Harrison Ranch looked like something out of a dream. Lanterns hung from the tree branches, swaying gently in the warm breeze, while wildflowers and mason jars lined the path to the wooden arbor that Colton had built himself with rough, careful hands. Emma stood in her room, looking at herself in the mirror, hardly recognizing the woman staring back. She wore a simple ivory dress, not fancy or overly fine, but made with care and love, the fabric flowing gently over her frame. Her hair was pinned up with a few loose curls framing her face, and there was a glow in her eyes that had nothing to do with powder or paint. It came from something much deeper: peace, contentment, and a joy she had never thought she would know. Sarah stood beside her, adjusting the small sprig of flowers pinned at her mother's shoulder. "You look beautiful, Mama," she said quietly, her voice a little choked. Emma smiled and cupped her daughter's face. "So do you," she replied, taking in Sarah's pretty blue dress and the confidence now settled in her eyes. "Are you ready?" Sarah nodded, and Tommy peeked around the doorframe, his hair sticking up in that familiar way, his best shirt slightly crooked but his grin wide. "They're all waiting," he announced, "and Papa looks nervous." Emma laughed softly at that, nerves fluttering in her own stomach, though they were sweet and warm instead of cold and heavy, like the ones she'd felt at her first wedding. This time, she wasn't walking into a bargain. She was walking into love. Outside, friends and ranch hands gathered in a small circle around the arbor, with Mrs. Callahan wiping at her eyes already and Hank trying to pretend there was dust bothering him. The minister stood quietly nearby, Bible in hand. Colton waited at the front, wearing his finest suit, his hair brushed back, his boots polished, but nothing could hide the way his hands trembled slightly as he looked down the path. When Emma stepped out into the yard, the world seemed to fall silent for him. The lanterns flickered, the wind eased, and all he could see was her walking toward him with Sarah and Tommy at her sides, the three of them a picture of the family he'd never dared to imagine he could have. His throat tightened with emotion. When they reached the arbor, Sarah and Tommy moved to stand just behind them, one hand resting lightly on each of their parents, as if they were connecting the circle they had all formed together. The minister spoke a few simple words about second chances, about love that grows from respect and daily choices rather than just sparks and passion. Then he nodded to Colton, inviting him to speak his vows. Colton took Emma's hands, his voice steady but thick with feeling. "Emma," he began, "when I first found you in that stable, I thought I was offering you shelter from the storm. I thought I was giving you something you didn't have. He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. But I was wrong. You were the one who brought shelter into my life. You took this house, which had been empty and quiet for so long, and filled it with warmth and laughter and the sound of children's footsteps. You gave me a home, not just a roof. You taught me that love doesn't always come in a rush. Sometimes it grows slow and steady, like a fire that starts from a single spark and becomes something that can keep you warm through the coldest winter. His fingers tightened slightly around hers. I vow to love you not because I must, but because I cannot imagine my life without you. I vow to see you every day, not as a duty or as someone I rescued, but as my partner, my equal, my friend, and the woman I cherish. I will stand by you in good seasons and hard ones, when the cattle are fat and when the fields are dry, when we laugh and when we cry. You are my heart, Emma. You always will be. By the time he finished, Emma's eyes were full of tears, but they were happy ones, shining in the evening light. She took a breath, steadying herself, and began her own vows. Colton, she said softly but clearly, when you found me, I was lost in more ways than one. I was cold, hungry, and tired down to my bones. I felt invisible to the world, like I was just another poor widow people pitied in passing. You saw me when I could barely see myself. You gave my children warmth, food, and safety. But more than that, you gave us dignity. You never treated us like charity. You treated us like we belonged here. Her voice trembled, but she kept going. At first, I was afraid to trust what we had. I thought this marriage would always be a trade, a careful arrangement we both tiptoed around. But you proved me wrong again and again. You chose me in the storm. You chose me when the town whispered. You chose me when my past threatened to take everything from us. And you gave up land that had your family's name on it, just so I could stand here without shame. You taught me that accepting love is not weakness. You taught me that I don't have to carry every burden alone. Tears slid down her cheeks as she smiled at him. I vow to stand beside you, not behind you. I vow to laugh with you, to argue with you when I must, to speak the truth and listen to yours. I vow to love your land and your work, to raise our children with you as partners, and to choose you every single day, just as you have chosen me. You are my safe place, my home, my heart. They exchanged new rings, simple gold bands that fit easily on fingers already used to the weight of commitment. As he slid the ring onto her finger, Colton said, "With this ring, I choose you freely." As she placed his ring on his hand, Emma replied, "With this ring, I choose you forever." When a minister pronounced them husband and wife for the second time, this time with no arrangement hanging between them, no debts, no hidden wounds, only love, Colton pulled her into a kiss that was tender, deep, and full of promise. The small crowd cheered. Sarah and Tommy hooped with delight, and Mrs. Callahan openly sobbed into her apron. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. Music from a fiddle and guitar, dancing under the stars, plates of food passed, and hands clapped in time. Colton danced with Emma, with Sarah, with a laughing Tommy standing atop his boots, and for one night, everything felt light and unburdened. 2 years passed, and the ranch only grew more alive. By the summer of 1880, the fields were green and rolling, the herd strong, and the Harrison Ranch had reputation and stability that even the sale of the North pasture couldn't shake. With smart choices and hard work, they'd expanded other parts of the land, started a small breeding program, and added new hands who quickly learned that their boss listened more than he shouted and that his wife's word carried weight too. Emma had become a true partner in every sense. She kept the household running smoothly, yes, but she also kept the books with a sharp eye, noticed where money was wasted, and suggested changes that made the ranch more profitable and efficient. The men respected her. They saw the way she worked, the way she treated everyone fairly, and they knew she was more than just the boss's wife. Sarah, now 9, walked with a straight back and an easy smile, her mind quick and curious. She no longer watched the world with constant suspicion. She called Colton Papa without thinking about it now. And often they could be found sitting together on the porch, a book between them, debating some story or fact, as if they were two scholars instead of a rancher and a little girl. Tommy, 6, rode as if he had been born in a saddle. He followed Colton everywhere, from the barn to the pastures, soaking up every bit of knowledge about horses, cattle, and land. When he fell, he got up. When he failed, no one called him useless or a burden. They just helped him try again. And Emma, well, she was round with child, their first baby together, due any day. She moved a little slower now, but her eyes were brighter than ever. Colton hovered around her with almost comical protectiveness, taking every heavy bucket from her hands, scolding her gently when he caught her trying to lift things she shouldn't, insisting she sit and rest more than she thought necessary. She teased him about it, but the truth was, every time his hands settled at the small of her back or rested on her growing belly, her heart melted all over again. One warm afternoon, they spread a blanket by the creek that cut through the lower part of the property. The water ran clear and cool over the stones, birds chattered in the trees, and the sky was big and blue, with only a few white clouds drifting lazily. Sarah sat under a cottonwood tree, reading aloud to Tommy, who lay on his stomach, kicking his feet and listening, while Emma and Colton sat side by side on the blanket, leaning back on their hands. Colton's palm lay possessively and gently over her belly, and every time the baby kicked, he grinned like a boy. "Boy or girl, what do you hope?" he asked. Emma tilted her head back, considering the question with a soft smile. "Honestly," she said, "it doesn't matter, as long as they're healthy and loved." He nodded. "They will be," he said firmly. "They'll be strong, too. They get that from their mother." She chuckled. "From her father as well, I'd say." She looked around, the laughing children, the shining water, the house in the distance, sturdy against the horizon, and a wave of gratitude washed over her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked quietly, already reading the shift in her expression. She turned to him and said, "How different my life is from that morning you found me in the stable. How I never could have imagined this." He brushed a knuckle along her jaw. "Any regrets?" he asked gently. She shook her head, eyes bright. "Not a single one," she said. You? He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Only that I didn't find you sooner," he answered. "We could have had more time." That evening, after the children were tucked into bed and the house was quiet, they sat together on the porch swing, the wood creaking softly beneath them as it rocked. The sky was deep blue fading to black, the first stars winking into view over the dark line of the hills. Emma rested her head on Colton's shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around her, his other hand once again resting on her belly, feeling the slow rolls and bumps of the baby inside. The air had a new edge to it, cooler than it had been the week before, carrying the faintest hint that summer wouldn't last forever. "Tell me again," Emma said softly after a while. "Tell you what, my love," he asked, his voice low and warm. "What you thought," she said, "the very first morning in the stable, when you saw me there." He smiled into the darkness, remembering clearly. "I thought, that woman deserves a better life than this," he answered. "And," she prompted. He kissed the top of her head. "And I wanted more than anything to be the one to give it to her." Her throat tightened. "You did," she whispered. "You gave me everything I never dared to even dream of. A home, safety, real love." He pulled her closer. "No, Emma," he said. "You gave me everything. You gave me a reason to live again." Just then, a soft white speck drifted down from the sky, landing on Emma's hand. She laughed quietly. "Look," she said. "Snow." More tiny flakes followed, swirling in the air. Not a storm this time, just a gentle reminder of the season to come. They watched it fall in comfortable silence for a moment. "Are you still afraid of winter?" he asked. She smiled, leaning into him. "Not anymore," she replied. "Not when I have you to keep me warm." Before he could answer, she suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her belly. He sat up straight. "What is it?" he asked, panic and hope warring in his eyes. She met his gaze, breathing through the first sharp wave. "I think," she said, voice shaky but full of wonder, "it's time." In an instant, he was on his feet, calling for Mrs. Callahan, steadying Emma as he helped her inside. Despite the fear that always comes with birth, he stayed calm, pressing her hands, whispering, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I'm right here with you." She believed him. He had never left her, not in storms, not in shame, not in fear. Hours later, at the very edge of dawn, as the first light painted the sky pale gold, Colton stepped out of their bedroom, exhausted but glowing, his face lit from inside with a joy so big it seemed to overflow. Sarah and Tommy, who had fallen asleep on the settee, waiting for news, bolted upright. "Well?" Sarah demanded, eyes wide. "Mama," Tommy echoed. Colton's smile spread slow and huge across his face. "You have a baby sister," he said. Sarah squealed, Tommy hooped, and they ran into the bedroom, where Emma lay propped against pillows, hair damp with sweat, face pale but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. The baby's face was small and perfect, her eyes closed, her little fist pressed against her cheek. Sarah touched her gently, awe in her voice. "She's so little," she whispered. "She won't stay that way long," Emma replied, her voice tired but full of love. Tommy leaned close. "Hi," he whispered to the baby. "I'm your big brother." Colton stood at the foot of the bed, taking in the sight, his wife, his children, his new daughter, and felt a wave of gratitude so strong it almost brought him to his knees. Outside, the snow continued to fall in soft, gentle flakes over the fields and barns, coating the world in white once more. But this winter was different from the one before. This time, the house was filled with warmth and laughter and the cry of new life. Once, Emma had been a desperate widow in the snow, cleaning another man's stable just to survive, her heart clenched with fear and her future nothing but a shadow. Once, Colton had been a lonely rancher, his heart locked away with memories of a life lost too soon. Now, together, they had built something neither of them could have imagined alone. A home that rang with love, a family bound not by necessity, but by choice, and a happiness that felt honest and hard-won and real. As the sun rose higher, flooding the room with soft light, Emma looked at Colton and squeezed his hand. "We made it," she whispered. He squeezed back, his eyes shining. "We did," he agreed. For them, the snow outside would never again just mean cold and hunger and loss. It would always be a reminder of the morning a rich cowboy found a poor widow in a frozen stable and decided that she and the life they could build together were worth everything.